Okay, so today's story is titled Broken Records. So we have the main character, this 14-year-old girl. Her name is Elizabeth. And she's upstairs in her room when she hears this commotion downstairs. She's not surprised. She's not afraid. She's not frightened. She knows. She knows these famous actions belong to her father. So she goes to the head of the staircase and she sees the swaying shadow in the doorway. Surprise, surprise, he's drunk. So she predicts every single span of events from that point to the point where her mother will inevitably come down the stairs, deposit this depressing sigh at the image of her husband sprawled out on the floor, and then begin to clean him up. So said, so done. He ambles into the foyer. He slips down the steps that lead into the living room. His foot hooks on to the end table that has her mother's favorite lamp, might I add, and it falls and it shatters. And he's just letting out a string of explicits. And of course, what then happens is her mother rushes down the steps. She spots her god-awful husband on the floor next to her splintered favorite lamp. Elizabeth just sort of ambles down the steps nonchalantly. There's no surprise, there's no sadness, there's nothing. It's just sort of a strong sense of indifference. And she sits on the couch across from her father, who's on the floor, and her mother, who is currently picking up the shards off the floor. Careful, careful, she says. I don't want you to get any splinters. Just, stay over there. And she rolls her eyes, even at her mother's care. Her mother's sincere concern for her. And then she looks at her father and she says, "You look great." He, of course, has absolutely no idea what is going on. He's drunk. And so her mother, feeling a little offended by her child's sarcasm at a time like this, says, "What are you doing? What is that?" So she doesn't respond to her mother. She just sort of looks back at her father and shakes her head and says, "You, seem to have had yourself a full night." And so her mother now stops picking up the shards of glass off the floor and she's like, "What is your problem?" And so she finally says, "Nothing, Mom, I'm fine. So her mother, a little bit more concerned with, all of these glasses on the floor and her husband on the other side, just continues to pick up the glasses, goes to the kitchen and does what she has to do to come back out with a wet washcloth to lay on her father's head. And then she says to her child, Elizabeth, "Do you think you can help me get him up off the floor?" So she was like, "No, I'm okay. I'm okay right here. As a matter of fact, I think he's okay right there as well." So then her mother is now on the verge of tears. She doesn't understand why her child is acting like this. "What are you doing?" she asks. "I just need you to help me get him off the floor. What is going on?" And she was like, "I feel like I would have been a little bit more willing to help had he remembered my lunch today. Had he remembered to pick me up from practice after school. Had he remembered that I had a doctor's appointment. I feel like I would have been a little bit more inclined to be his child if he felt inclined to be my father." So her mother then sits down and the tears are streaming and she's like, "I don't need this right now, Elizabeth. I really don't need this. We just need to get him off the floor and you can go back to bed and I won't bother you." So she feels a little bit of sympathy for her mother at this point. And she goes over and she helps her lift him up off the floor and toss him onto the couch. And then she turns around and looks at the remaining mess on the floor. And then she goes back over and sits down and stares at her father and she just shakes her head and starts to laugh a little. And then her mother turns around just sort of exhausted with the entire situation and she doesn't even bother asking her what the problem is now. But then her laughter sort of bubbles up a little bit more. It gets a little bit more excitable and then her mom gets concerned. Her mom's like, "I am living with psychopaths. What is going on? What are you laughing at, Elizabeth?" And so the laughter somehow gets choked out by tears, like sobs, like she's crying now. Elizabeth is crying. The same person that had that facade of indifference, that sarcasm that was just falling out her mouth at the drop of a dime is now sobbing. And so her mother now, sets the shards of glass onto the famous end table. And she's like, "What is the problem? What is it? What is going on?" And so Elizabeth was like, I wish you and I were listening to the same thing. I feel like we're listening to two very, very different things. We're seeing very different things. And she was like, what are you talking about? And she was like, Mom, I feel like we're constantly listening to the same broken record, and I feel like I'm the only one who knows how to turn it off.